everyone, and welcome back. This is the first lecture in a two-part series on visual rhetoric. So one of the things that we're going to be doing in our technical and professional writing course is designing documents and designing an informative presentation. So I have some notes for you if you haven't done a PowerPoint before. There are other types of programs out there to do a visual presentation, things like SlideShare and Google Docs, but for this class, I really want to make sure that you know how to use PowerPoint so that you're a little bit more proficient in those Microsoft products when you go out into the business world. So a lot of times, people create a PowerPoint presentation, they don't always have good design principles. And the same thing goes for some of the other technical documents we're going to discuss. So things like manuals, if later on you take another tech writing class or you get into more advanced stuff and you start doing lab reports or white papers, there are still some elements of design that you need to use. So that's going to be the first part, which I'll talk about today. The second part of the presentation on visuals is actually visual rhetoric. And in that, we're going to be talking about how visuals can be used to inform, to persuade, to convince your audience. So let's get started with some principles of design. I want you first to look at the picture that I've got right here. I have a dark background. I have light lettering. I'm going to get my pen out here. White letters, dark background, and then I've picked a visual that's kind of interesting. And we've got here what's called negative space or white space with negative space here, using that hole in the person's head, and then white space is kind of what's happening all around it. So it's fairly balanced, right? The title slide, the words are big, there's a clear font, there's an interesting picture. And let's look at the same information, but presented a little bit differently. Visual rhetoric, and there's our picture. So much is wrong here. And I haven't seen too many times where people put their words small so that it goes, one word goes onto the second line there. I haven't also too many times, this is a wrong, incorrect, horrible use of white space. What I have seen a lot, because a lot of times people put, that'll be in the middle and that'll be all right. What I have seen a lot of mistakes with when students do presentations especially is that they believe that the red on the green would be a really cool contrast, and it doesn't work, and we'll talk about why in a moment. If you're looking at, to me, this makes my eyes bleed. It's really hard to read, even though it's a simple font. The picture isn't bad, but it's small and it's not really spaced well, right? So, there we go, visual rhetoric. Let's see that again. What's wrong here? Well, first of all, you don't want in a presentation, a professional presentation, but really any presentation, you don't want crazy animations. If you've noticed from my lectures, a lot of the times the animations I'm giving you are very simple. Something appears, maybe it pops up, but it's not going to spin and dip and all that. The other thing here, I don't hate, the words are easy to read, but it's kind of dated because this type of word art is this kind of thing that would have been used in the 90s. I would have seen this on a presentation in 1995 in one of my, would have been in middle school then, maybe. I don't want to date myself too much. But it's quite dated, right? So it gives the information, but it doesn't really look contemporary. So the first element of design, and really the most important for technical and professional writing, is readability. After content, it really is the most important element of the document or presentation. So tips for making things readable. Number one, high contrast colors for background and text. So black on white, as I have here, white background, black words. As I did in the first slide, I think that might have been a dark blue. It doesn't always have to be black and white, right? Readability, this word here, I have this not just in the regular red, which you can see in my pen, but like a little bit of a maroon red because it shows up on the white and is more readable than just the regular red. So that's something to kind of consider. It's really important for everyone, especially when you have a presentation where people might be sitting far back, like in an auditorium or a large hall or a big meeting room. It's particularly important though for people with visual impairments. So that second slide that I showed you with the red on the green, for someone, and if this is you, you might not have been able to see it, but for somebody who's red-green colorblind, it doesn't mean that those colors don't show up at all. They show up a lot of times as different shades of gray. So if you have somebody with a visual impairment like that, if you have somebody who's wearing glasses, it'll be a little bit more difficult for them to, quite a bit more difficult rather, for them to read. So you really want to try to make sure that all of your content is accessible. Using non-script sans serif fonts, I'm going to explain that a little bit more later. Script is basically fonts that look like cursive, right? So if I have, I'm trying here, readability. Okay, that's script. That's not as legible or as readable as the top thing. And especially with script, depending on people's age and when they went through school, I have some students who are 18, 19, 20 who did not learn cursive in school, and I have other people who do. Some schools it's taught and some schools it's not. So again, trying to make sure that you're hitting your entire audience. Not only is it harder to read, especially if you have a visual impairment, but also if you never learned cursive in school, cursive fonts can be difficult to decipher sometimes. In PowerPoint presentations, like this one, keep all fonts above 22 points. Again, for the most part, that's for readability, making things easier to read. In my PowerPoint presentations that I'm putting here on YouTube, because this is a little bit of a different format for teaching for me, I put more information on than I do in the classroom. So this presentation in the classroom, I think number 1 just says high contrast. Number 2 says sans serif and non-script fonts. Number 3 just says fonts above 22 point. Because we're in an online format here, and because this is a class and not a business presentation, I sometimes give you guys more words on the screen than I would if we were in person, and certainly much more than I would in a business meeting where they have the information in front of them and I'm kind of recapping it, summarizing it, going through it for them, highlighting main points, and then talking to fill in those blanks. So that's something to keep in mind too. This is a little bit of do as I say, not as I do, because my things here for you, also because in my classes sometimes people just print out the PowerPoints, they're not able to watch them, or they're not able to listen. So I have to have more information than I normally would in other situations. So that's something to think about too. Headings can be in a different color, font, or size. I don't care which. Here I've got the heading bolded and in a different color and in a little bit bigger size. So I did all 3 to kind of make it stand out a little bit more. That readability is distracting me as I talk here. So there we go. You can see the heading a little bit better, right? Without that distractible thing in the middle. Use white space for visual breaks between information. We're going to talk a lot more about that in a moment as well, what that means and how to do it. So, readability, what not to do. This is almost exactly a slide that I got one time. The font is in a different font, but it's bold already, and then they bolded it more. It's not even on the same line, and it's a serif font, which again we'll talk about. Then we have this script font for the text. This is exactly the same information that I just gave you on the last screen, but it's completely unreadable. Everything is pushed together. Everything is in this scripty font. It's hard to read, and we've got gray on gray. And I have students do this with gray on gray. You know, you can do gray on gray, but really your background then has to be almost white, and your font has to be, your text has to be almost black. So there has to be a higher contrast there. So the other thing that I didn't say for readability, having things in technical documents, especially where you are bullet pointing, you are numbering, you're having check marks, that really helps with readability. You can see these tips here, 1 through 5, same tips on this screen, but without that white space that a list provides. So what is a serif font or a sans serif font? When you have a letter like this with the A, the serif is, as it's circled over there, but I'll circle it here too. The serif is these little markers here that stick out from the font. Sans serif doesn't have those markers, so it's just straight. So sans means without, and it means that it's without those serifs. Now, they're actually used for different purposes, and I use serif fonts for some documents and then sans serif for others, and I'll talk about that in just a second. In presentations, sans serif fonts are easier to read across the room because these little serifs break up the readability, and it makes it a little bit more difficult to see. So you can see in this presentation, I'm using a sans serif font. A serif font would kind of look on the S. It would have oops, it's so difficult, little marks like that. It'd probably have a little one on the E. It'd have one on the R right here, and right here. Now, I'm making those bigger than they would be because it's hard to control this mouse. But you can kind of see how that would look, right? Same thing for the text of my presentation. I think this font might be Calibri, and then I use Calibri Bold in that red for my headers. Again, the fonts should be above 20 points in size. I recommend, really, I like to go bigger even than that. I like to go about 28 to 36. I think when you get above that, it looks like you don't have enough information. So if you have something where it's like 60 point font and you make 1 point on the screen, it's going to be a little bit too big and it makes it look thin. In longer documents like reports, serif fonts are actually easier to read. So if you look at a book, books will use a serif font. Things that are in print usually use serif fonts. If you have a book on a Kindle, for example, you can pick between serif and sans serif. So depending on what works best for your eyes. But a lot of times in longer documents, we'll use those serif fonts. I had a book that was printed recently by my publishing company. It wasn't my book, but we printed it through our publishing company, and it was a collection of short stories. So the author in that case actually wanted a sans serif font because it wasn't meant to be read all at once, right? But his other book, which was a novel, that one had a serif font. So most professional documents are going to use a standard serif font, such as Times New Roman, usually 12, sometimes 11 to 13 in size. Sometimes you'll see something like fonts that are similar to that, Baskerville Old Face or Baskerville New Face, maybe. What's the other one? Georgia is similar to that. Helvetica, I think, might be a serif font. So think about that when we get into the report writing, but usually your best bet is going to be Times New Roman 12. That's pretty standard for those types of documents. Color harmony is also important. Primary colors, secondary colors, and tertiary colors. If you haven't taken an art class before, it's interesting because with with actual pure light colors, you're not going to have the same things, but for our purposes here, secondary colors are the primary colors mixed together. So red and yellow is orange, yellow and blue is green, blue and red is purple, right? Then you get tertiary colors. So blue and purple, we have a little bit more blue for one, a little bit more purple for the other, for that violet color, right? Red and orange mixed together, you're going to get that red-orange right here. Orange with yellow, you're going to get a little bit lighter orange, yellow with green, etc. So in visual experience, harmony is something that is pleasing to the eye. It engages the viewer and it creates a sense of order or balance in your visual experience. Something is not harmonious, usually it's either boring or it's chaotic, and I'm going to show you examples of both coming up in a minute. So one extreme is a visual experience that's so bland that the viewer's not engaged. If their brain shuts off, they're going to start playing with their phone during their presentation. They're not really going to know where to look on your slide. The other is so extreme that it's overdone and it's chaotic, so the viewer can't stand to look at it. It doesn't know how to organize it, and it can't understand that information. And this is typically what I see. Things that are too extreme. Sometimes I have something that's boring from a student, or I do some work with businesses as well where they'll use just, black and white and no pictures. Which don't always put a picture on your slide. Picture or a graph or a table or a chart. Something. You have to have a visual in addition to the text. Usually though, what happens with people who are new in business or people who are students and learning is that they go to the opposite extreme. They want their presentation to look interesting, so they put too much in there. So the color wheel I was just talking about, you can do a couple of different things here. And I'm going to show you some examples of both. You can either pick a color scheme that's like you're using black and white, right? And then you kind of go within a little bit of a range. So let's say I'm going to use these three kind of colors in my color scheme. Those are the complementary colors. You can also use contrasting colors. So maybe I have this orange and then I also use this blue. This is actually something that those are the colors that we use for our publishing company, the orange and the blue, because they're contrasting and they give the viewer kind of an interesting visual experience. So that's what's in the logo that we have. What I see a lot of times are people trying to do like a rainbow of colors. And sometimes you can have one visual with multiple colors, but if you have lots of visuals and too many colors, again, it's going to be a little bit overdone and chaotic. So for example, here's understimulated. There is open white space here. Again, I'm going to talk about that more later. And the fonts are the right size, and I actually kind of like that visual. It's a really cool picture if you're doing a presentation about recycling, right? It's like an interesting word graphic. But because of the colors, our brains are a little bit understimulated. Now, I realize this might look cool, but that's because all of our other slides have been black and white with high contrast. So the green is a little bit of a visual break, but quite frankly, the light green wording on the dark green background is really not that high enough of a contrast. And eventually, if you had a business meeting where all of your slides looked like this, I've been in some meetings where people will keep that like they'll be like, that's a cool graphic, right? So they keep it for the entire presentation and they don't have any other pictures. It's just the words that are changing, and it's green on green on green on green, and it's just too dull. It's way too dull, especially without a new picture to kind of keep that interest. So that's being understimulated. Overstimulated. I put it up all at once so that it would hit your brain at the same time. We've got a visual over here with blues and greens and purples, and then we've got the heading in purple. We've got a background that's not quite black. The text is in different colors, right? Orange, and I think that might be like a light green again, and then yellow. We've got another picture here that does sort of matches with this, but there's not, it's just too much, right? So if you had this in a presentation in a business meeting, and you might be doing this right now as I'm talking because it's all up at the same time. That's one of my other keys. If you put things, if you animate things and have them appear one at a time while you're talking, it helps people stay stimulated because they're looking at one piece at a time. But here, your eye doesn't really know where to travel. So some people might drift down here to this white space because it's almost the only visual break we get, that little bit of white around that graphic. Other people might be bouncing around. If you have ADD or ADHD, I do. I would be looking at this, then I'd be reading this, then I'd be reading that, then I'd be up here reading the thing. Like my mind doesn't quite know where to go. So when our brains are overstimulated like that, they actually turn off the same way they do when they're understimulated. So if you're looking just at this over and over and over, you become understimulated, your brain shuts off and you start thinking of other things. When you're overstimulated, your brain shuts off, or it's like in hyper mode where you're not really taking in the information that you need to. That's really what the last thing that you want for your readers or the people in your audience. So just right. One thing at a time. We got a nice purple heading here, different font, different size. I really like this font. It's sans serif, but it's kind of like bold in the right way. It's interesting. We have one graphic, one green visual. It's a cool picture. It doesn't add any words to distract from the primary text. The heading is larger, as I said, different sans serif font than the text and in purple. The color wheel, purple that we talked about, purple and this green are right across from each other on the color wheel. I took a lot of time figuring out what purple to get right for that font so that it would be directly across. There's easy ways to do that though. When you color something, usually you can pick from the color wheel or they give you that spectrum. So I go on the color wheel, see what color my picture is, and then pick the color that's opposite it. There we go. I have this. If I were doing this as a business presentation, I wouldn't have a second graphic here, but I just sort of want to show you a color scheme based on those contrasting colors, right? There, the purple that I've got, a little bit more red. This one that I have goes that way. So they really are across from each other in that way. That use of colors creates a little bit of disharmony, just enough to interest the eye. And by putting the bullet points animated one at a time, you're following my points as I go, hopefully. So your brain in that way is not turned off and it's stimulated, but it's not overstimulated. Size. Size in this case actually does matter. Maybe not in other cases, but here it does. So our eyes move toward things because they're different, not necessarily because they're large or small. Our eyes are actually impressed by novelty more than sheer size or color. So you could leave the font here for my title. I could have left it the same size and just had it a different color, or I could have left it the same size and just had it in bold. You can see I put the word different here in italics because your eye travels to that word different. That's the word that I want to stand out, right? That's what I mean by novelty, something new. A person's height, for example, isn't so noticeable until the principle of contrast comes into effect. What do I mean by that? Well, here are Conan O'Brien and Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. They're about the same height, right? So if I cropped them that way, there's nothing really to interest me there. They're both over 6 feet, and you know, it's kind of, it's an interesting picture if you're interested in them, but we don't have that contrast. Now, when I had the second half of the picture with the young fan that they're with, now we have a contrast. This little kid trying to be cool next to these really giant looking, gangly looking, in Conan O'Brien's case, these two really tall men. So in documents and presentations, think about placing headings in different sizes and weights so that the eye can travel easily to those parts of the document. As I said, the word size, if I had kept it the same font as the rest of the stuff, it still would have stuck out, but it wouldn't have stuck out as much as if I have it in a different size and a different color. It's really the contrast that your eye is drawn to. Here is an example of weight in fonts. This is with Helvetica. So we're moving from Helvetica thin. This is a sans serif. No serifs on here. No little marks. Thin all the way up to the heavy. This is 95. This is size 35. So the contrast here might be greater, or if you wanted to have the rest of your text in the thin 35, you could do that, and they're not different in terms of the type of font, but they are different in terms of size and weight, so there would be enough of a contrast there. You can tell that sorry guys, sometimes my mic cuts out. You can tell that this would have, even with me having all the stuff in the middle, you can tell the difference and how it would stick out if you were doing a presentation. So here's an example of a document. This is a fake resume, but this is an unformatted resume. It has the person's name, tarnation, the objective, their education, their related coursework, and the beginning part of their employment history. If you are an executive who's doing hiring, you have to be able to scan a resume very quickly to find out if the person is a right fit for your company. And this unformatted document makes it really hard to do that. To be honest with you, my eye travels to the fact that they took this coursework right here because there's some white space there. There's a little bit of space and a little bit of space after employment history, and that's where my eye travels. I'm going to skip this big block of text here, which is too bad because they have an objective, which we'll talk about later. You don't really need that. But they have some skills and abilities here like Internet Explorer and Microsoft Office Suite, as well as QuickBooks and Sage Timeslips. I don't really care that you can use Internet Explorer. Anybody can use a search engine, right? But not a lot of people can use QuickBooks, and especially Sage Timeslips, which is a very niche program. So how can we help them format this? We're going to use size, as I just talked about. Tarnation, now it's in bold. I see their name right away. Education is right there with the related coursework. There's another section probably later on that has the stuff about their skills, which actually would go later on, unless it's directly related to whatever job they're putting in for. So if they're putting in for an accountant position and they have QuickBooks skills in QuickBooks, then they should put that up at the top, related coursework, and then maybe skills right underneath that. Then we have their employment history. So education, related coursework, and employment history all stick out, as do the fact that we're using these bullet points, which I talked about before. Yeah, it's way better, and it's much easier for an executive to scan this and to see those points that they need to see. So, white space. I've mentioned this a couple times, but I want to go into a little more depth. So, the document that I'm showing over on the right-hand side, the white space is this color blue right here, and then we have even more white space around there. The graphics are very evenly spaced. We have a different picture up at the top and then the text, right? Sort of showing you how a document would be laid out. White space is the area between the design elements. It's also the space within individual design elements. So things like space between letters in a font. So as I said here, it's this whole indigo. It's this whole indigo or violet. You can see how there's space in between these balloons. There's space around that square picture, and there's also space around the whole thing. Design theory really promotes the use of white space. It gives the document elegance, and it helps to ensure a quality user experience. This is directly related to what I just discussed with having your eye be overstimulated. White space allows for visual breaks so that I'm not overstimulated while I'm looking at something. Some people think that white space is wasted space. And again, as I said, my presentations here online for you guys have much less white space just because of the type of presentation I'm doing. It'd be a lot harder for you to read along if, you know, only 3 or 4 words that I was saying showed up on the screen, right? But a lot of times when people start doing presentations, they fill every inch of that slide with stuff. And most of the time you want to break that into multiple slides that you can then click through. Helps you stay on point a little bit better. A lot of people think that white space could be used for more information or for other visual elements. Another place where I see a problem with this when I work with businesses is in manuals. They'll have some directions upside down. They'll have a graphic shoved in. They'll put text really small, like 9-point font. Now, sometimes if it's manual or instructions that come with a product, you don't want to have a huge booklet, right? On I think what we're going to look at for an example is a food dehydrator. You don't want a huge booklet if you're trying to get it onto one page, but you also then need to simplify directions. You don't want everything in like a 7-point font that nobody can read. So the correct use of white space can actually help capture your reader's attention, stimulate their brains in the right way. There's 2 types of white space, active and passive. Active white space means that space has been deliberately left blank. It helps to structure the page and emphasize different areas of content. Passive white space is the empty space around the outside of the page or blank areas in a page that result from poor design. So in our previous picture, this lighter indigo here, this lighter purple, that's a really good use of passive white space. Just gives you kind of a white border around the document that you're looking at. But some instances, passive white space happens because of poor design. So for example, with this picture, this image right here probably should have been extended to meet the same margins as this, and then we'd have more of that active white space between elements instead of passive white space that is not being used. So here is a really good example of how to use white space. We've got an interesting visual, and we've got kind of a nice like curve of white space here. This document has nice curves. And we've got some white space here, right? What's interesting to me is that we haven't gotten into this persuasion bit yet, but one of the reasons that this image looks like it does is because they've airbrushed her out to make her look thinner. So she's actually kind of disappearing here, right? It gives the line of her stomach as being like there, and the line of her back as being here-ish. And it's probably, you know, about there. So just something to keep an eye out for. Anyway, I'm going to erase that. There we go. So we have the white space here. Fill that in with red. We have way too much white space here from where this poor girl has been airbrushed away. Same thing with her arm, right? And then we have some white space. I really like what they did here with the font. They put more space between each letter, right? And they used a font that has really open letters. There's a lot of space even in between. Fashion and with the A and the O with the E's. Then we have this use of fashion in red so that it sticks out more. We have a little bit of a script almost. It's the same font, it's just in italics. That means that it's slanted slightly to draw your attention. So they have what would be here a quote. Lorem ipsum is the text that we use when we're putting together a document, and then later on you go in and you put your actual text there. It's kind of like fake Latin. The L. So there's a little bit of white space here around the quote, and there's white space in between the paragraphs. It's a really nice balanced design. Our eye is drawn first to the visual, and then, so to erase this again, when you first look at this, typically your eye is drawn here first, and then it moves over, and then it moves down. That's how that white space kind of draws your attention. My eye too is kind of drawn down here as well, so that in a way, I scan this possibly before reading everything in detail. Right. Again, in a magazine, that's kind of the thing. Have an interesting visual to grab attention, have an attention-grabbing headline, and then draw people down into reading the text. Or if it doesn't interest them, they see a cool picture, maybe they read just the caption, and then they keep moving along. Flip to the next page. All right, what not to do. I want you to just take this in for just a moment, if you can. When I first saw this, I saw this on a page about bad web design. What people have to say about Penny Juice. Who is Penny Juice up here in the corner with a penny and a little kid, and then there's some trees. The children at Kid College love the taste of Penny Juice and drink it without encouragement. I love the prompt service. I've been using it in my childcare center for 2 years. So I kind of get that it's juice, but I'm not exactly sure what they do. It's quite confusing. All of the text is the same size. So the terms of some of the design elements here that we've been talking about. Number one, too many colors. They're not even in the right order. We've got purple, blue, green, yellow, orange, red, which is like a reverse of the rainbow. But then we have purple, then we have light purple, then we have a lighter blue that doesn't even match the blue at the top. And then we had more colors after that I didn't even show you guys, right? There's almost no white space. We've got a little bit here. We've got a little bit between the trees up here, but for the most part, there's nowhere for our eyes to go, right? It's and also a lot is spelled wrong, and we have it as one word instead of two, so we're missing the space between the A and the L. It's very difficult to look at and to read. So let's see their redesign, and we'll talk about what they did differently and how it is improved. All right. This is the mobile version. So the white here that I've got in the corner is actually not there on the actual website. However, we now have Penny Juice up here with their slogan. It makes sense with the C. I kind of like that. I have their contact information right away, leader in childcare juice, and then their links through their website are right up there. We have a little bit of a limited color palette. I probably would not have used the red for the buttons, but I can understand why they did, because we've got this nice complementary green, yellow, blue. Those are very close to each other on that color wheel. The red is a contrast, and it lets people see their buttons to order now and to learn more right away. I probably would have used maybe a different blue that still stuck out, but that's just me. Then 100% blended fruit juice concentrate, specifically designed for childcare centers. Okay, good. Now I know exactly what it is. Rainbows of exciting flavors. And now we have just the rainbow in this word art here. That's where I get my rainbow, right? A couple other colors in the picture, a couple other colors in this picture. For the most part, it's much more harmonious. I can find out who they are, how to contact them, learn more, order now, and exactly what they do all on one page, whereas the previous page, I had no idea what was going on. I wouldn't even know where to start to try to contact them on here. I scrolled all the way down to the bottom and I couldn't find, I think you had to click one of these and then it went to more information. It was really confusing. So, better use of white space, better use of color, better use of images, which we're going to talk a little bit more about in part 2 of this series, and it's easier for professionals to find their information. It looks more professional. That's the biggest thing, right? This first version, I think this is some guy who set up a GeoCities site in like 1996, 1994, and never changed anything, which I'm going to guess is probably what happened, because that's what it looks like. And having different sizes here, different fonts, also helps to draw people's attention to the information that's actually important. Let's take a look at another one. Oh my goodness. I don't even know where to start here. Services of interest, contact, talk to me, bottle talk, need an appraisal. It's confusing again. What do they do? Visually, I can't really tell. With need an appraisal, I'm gonna guess that they do appraisals. We've got this wrong contrast here with the red on the blue. I can't hardly read it. It says big news, February 16th, Milwaukee Bottle and Advertising Club. I can tell you right now, if my mother was reading this, she would not be able to. She has glasses and she's had LASIK surgery. She has got a lot of issues with her eyes. It's blurry font. That could be just because of how it came out here. And we've got a tiny bit of white space here, but not a whole lot. Every inch of this is used up. Pictures that are confusing. Bottle picture in the background that the text is over the top of. When you have a picture in the background like that, it's got to be higher contrast, because here's what happens. This line of this bottle, okay, is breaking up how I'm reading this text. It makes it much less readable. So let's look at their redesign. At least here I could see the links for the parts of their page. The other one with the penny juice, I couldn't. So here's the redesign. Boom! Wow! Much more visually interesting, right? This is the mobile version. So again, on the website, they don't have this white space here. But that's just sort of how it came out when I put it into the presentation. So we've got their links are at the top. Need an appraisal is still there with that little pig thing. You can also do a search. We've got an interesting thing here. All of these are labeled. In a professional or technical document, we have to make sure that those labels are there when we need them. So this isn't the most readable font, but it is their logo. And if I had been them, I probably would have put at the very top Mr. Bottles and then had the logo kind of underneath, since it's not quite as legible. We've got Antique bottle collectors resource. Good. Now I know exactly who they are. And then it goes into the text where it talks, where it talks a little bit more about them. To be honest with you, I probably would have taken this picture out. We already have this, which is very visually interesting, and this, which is kind of a close-up of some of those antique bottles. If they had taken this picture out and centered this and then made this font a little bit bigger, it might have been that much more impactful, so that this little picture down here isn't fighting with this really cool professional picture up here. The Antique Bottle Collectors Resource, I probably would have put that maybe in bold, but I don't mind the color. The gray is not bad. White might have worked better, but they're trying to make it a little bit different from the white text. So I get that. So in terms of white space, we've got white space around the pictures. We've got a lot of white space here. I mean, it's brown, right? But it doesn't matter. White space is just referring to that space. And it's used really well so that it draws our attention. I'm going to erase this. It draws our attention from the sides right into the middle. So we look at this first, and maybe the logo second, and then it brings our eye down and looking at their header here for the About Them page. So we've also got white space here around this picture. We've got it here around this picture. And again, bringing our eye into the text that they want us to read. So design-wise, it's quite a bit better. Things to remember. Here's our recap. I love this picture. I don't have a Mac, but I just think this use of white space is brilliant. It's got iMac here, right? Performance design taken right to the edge. The only color is on the screen showing you how vivid and how awesome their product is. And then we can look at all the other links to pages on their website later, right? Their menu up above. It's so good. It's a brilliantly designed ad. So things to remember. Number one, high contrast for text. With this iMac, I've got a different font and it is larger, right? So it could be that. It could be like with Remember up above, that it's a different color and a different weight as well. That word remember is bold and it is heavier than the text I'm using for my the rest of the text in the presentation. Emphasize headings by using size, font, and color. Use sans serif fonts online and in presentations. So also without those little marks, right? And high contrast, as I said before, not just size, font, and color, but black on white, white on black, a bright color on a white background. You have to make sure that people can see it in the back and that those with visual impairments are being able to still watch and enjoy your presentation. Serif fonts should be used when you're doing longer reports. So proposals, manuals, instructions. Usually those are going to get serif fonts. Pops of color to draw the eye to certain space. As I said before, right over there, beautiful flower right there, drawing my eye right to the screen, which is the product they want to sell me. Use a range of colors next to each other on the color wheel, or use complementary colors that are across from each other on the color wheel. Make good use of white space to move your reader's eye to specific areas and give them visual or cognitive breaks. So those are all the basic principles of design. If you take a design class later on, you'll learn a lot more about it. But I feel like this can give you some tips on how to make those informative presentations stand out in the right way. If you're doing web design later on, these are principles that you can use in web design, as we just looked at. And if you're creating a report, there are still some of these principles that are still going to be in play, even if that is just a typical standard report with black and white paper with black print on it. You can still bold things, you can put things in lists, you can put things with numbers, you can use white space to draw people's eye to the information you want, you can italicize a word to make it different. You still are going to need headings and subheadings, so making those a tiny bit bigger, that kind of thing. So I hope that this was helpful and informative, and next time we're going to be talking about how to use visual rhetoric, meaning how to argue, how to persuade people, and if you're just supposed to inform, how to keep that persuasion out of your presentation. So that is it, and I will see you guys next time. Thanks.